Chapters 29 and 30 show some of the literary activity of Jeremiah. Chapter 29 is about letters or documents sent between Jerusalem and Babylon. In 597, Nebuchadnezzar besieged Jerusalem and, after King Jeconiah had surrendered, deported the priests, warriors, artisans, and the social elite to Babylon, which you can read about in 2 Kings 24, from verse 8 onwards. Going back a bit in Jeremiah, it was in chapter 24 that the Lord showed Jeremiah a vision of 2 baskets of figs in front of the temple. This vision also is dated to just after this deportation. One basket of figs is very good, and the other is very bad, so that they cannot be eaten. The Lord explains that the good figs are those who have been deported, the current exiles. The bad figs, now under the reign of Zedekiah, are those who were left in Judea. The vision indicates that God will bless the exiles, the good figs, using the language of building up that he had used in Jeremiah's commission. But the bad figs will be annihilated. This is the background to what Jeremiah writes now to the exiles. He will explain to them that the exile community, though uprooted, will now be planted and will grow, whereas that which remained will be plucked up and destroyed. Jeremiah's letter begins by telling the exiles to settle down. He uses the language of blessing and restoration. In other places, not being able to marry or to eat the fruit of one's own vineyard, or having someone take your house, is a curse, a description of punishment and woe. But here, for the exiles of all people, it is being reversed. They are even to pray for the well-being of Babylon, to seek its benefit, to be a blessing to it. In this way, they will thrive. But it's crucial that the exiles ignore the false prophets among them. God is not promising a swift return. They are there for a long time. God will deal with Babylon when the time is right, but for now they must focus on their present task, which is to settle and multiply, as they did in Egypt. The false prophets, however, as Hananiah did in the previous chapter, are forecasting a brief exile, one lasting less than 2 years. But in verse 10, the Lord declares it will actually be 70, as he had already declared back in 25:11-12. What this meant to the original recipients of this prophecy was that they would never see home again. Instead, it would be their grandchildren and their children who would see this promise fulfilled. The number 70 was also a symbolic number, and a multiple of 2 other symbolic numbers for completeness, 7 and 10. But even so, depending on how you reckon it, this prophecy was literally fulfilled. 2 Chronicles 36 seems to be reckoning it from the destruction of the temple in 586 to its restoration in 516, which Zechariah and Daniel seem to agree with. But Jeremiah 25 and 29 link it to the rule of Babylon. Babylon's rule ended when Cyrus defeated them in 539 BC. Nebuchadnezzar took the throne in 605, so 605 to 539 would be 66 years, and would be good enough to fit the symbolic value of 70. But King Josiah died in 609 BC. The significance of this is that after him, Judah was forced to accept a king by foreign appointment, which was Jehoiakim. This symbolizes then the beginning of Babylonian rule. Between 609 and 539 BC is exactly 70 years. This fits even better with the prophecy in Jeremiah 25:11-12, where he says that this whole land shall become a ruin and a waste, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. Then after 70 years are completed, I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation, the land of the Chaldeans, for their iniquity. But even though this may be the correct answer, there were also other ways to understand it. I already mentioned 2 Chronicles 36, which seems to measure from the destruction to the restoration of the temple rather than Babylonian rule. But in Daniel 9, as we shall see later in our readings this year, Gabriel reinterprets Jeremiah's 70 years as 490 years. So we must be alive to the various hidden layers of meaning that can exist in prophecy, that in the case of Jesus were revealed to his apostles and prophets. In chapter 30, the Lord now tells Jeremiah to write a book. This is known as the Book of Consolation. God does not ignore the sins which brought Israel and Judah to their current plight, but now he promises that he will gather them back in, restore and heal. These promises seem to contain a mixture of the near and far, or rather, the far and the very far. Some of these will be fulfilled in the return under Cyrus, but some await a more distant future. Both Israel, that is the northern kingdom, and Judah, the southern kingdom, are the recipients of this promise. But only Judah returned from this exile, and the remaining 10 tribes are still awaited. Also, verse 9 and 21 contain rare references to a Davidic king, which the Lord will raise up for them from among their own people. This again is something the Jews would have to wait for. Important also for these promises is the judgment of those nations who had brought them such harm, even though at the time they were actually performing God's will. This is not just punishment, but an assurance of protection, that these foreigners will not be able to harm them again. They will have an end, as God says in verse 11, but you, Israel, will not have an end. In verse 14, God says that all their lovers have abandoned them, since God so punished his people. These lovers never actually cared for Israel and deserted them as soon as disaster struck. But in verse 22, God declares that you shall be my people and I will be your God. God destroyed in order to heal. He plucked up in order to plant. Finally, the verses from 23:19 to 20 reappear as the last 2 verses of the chapter. The Book of Consolation continues in chapter 31.